Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a review of this very odd, but somehow compelling, if you're into that sort of thing, release. The super deluxe, uber complete edition of the second Glenn Gould recording of Bach's Goldberg variations with all of the existing session tapes. In other words, all the outtakes, all the repeats, all the conversations, which are, by the way, beautifully transcribed in this book. I mean, you get this fabulous coffee table book. There are 10 CDs of session tapes, and then you get the actual released Goldberg variations. So that's 11 CDs in all. It costs something like $100. Which I think is like sort of crazy. But again, it's a specialty item. It's a coffee table book. It cost real money to make. I mean, they spared no expense in putting this thing together. It's Sony. And they have it's a companion, let's put it this way, to the 1955 Goldberg variation sessions, which has also been released in some, multi-disc extravaganza. The question for many people is that, do you need this? Well, unless you think that Glenn Gould was one of the great geniuses of 20th century pianism, and you're fascinated to hear how it was done, you don't need this. You do need a Glenn Gould Goldberg variations because they are iconic recordings, both of them, by one of the great Bach players of the 20th century, and someone, who was more identified with that work than anybody in history. So yeah, you need to have Glenn Gould's Goldberg variations in some form or another. But this, I'll just say straight up front, this deluxe thingy is for serious collectors. Now, if you're a ClassicsToday.com insider, you can hie on over and run a search, and Jed Disler reviewed this for us very, very beautifully with some sound samples so you can hear what the differences are. As Jed pointed out in his review, some of the most remarkable things about Glenn Gould is how these sets kind of eliminate some of the mythology that surrounds him. I mean, some of it was, he cultivated it. It's what he wanted. I mean, he really created a persona for himself. But when it came to his work in the studio, as is so often the case with the best artists, and he was one of the best, no question about it, he was completely professional. He knew what he wanted. He was prepared. He was cordial and easy to work with. He was, everybody's, you get all these, reminiscences and essays and things. But, they say, for example, that Gould required less splicing than many other artists, which makes sense because he stopped giving concert performances and only worked in the studio. You'd think this guy would really know how to work in the studio. And he did. He knew what he wanted. He knew how to get it. He was willing to listen to what other people told him, to do things over again when it was necessary. He was not quirky. I mean, there are wonderful stories about just how weird he was. And some of them are true and some of them aren't. But when it came to his actual physical work with his engineers about the music he loved and cared about, he was right there with no nonsense. And, the same was true, for example, of Maria Callas, who was another person who was famous for, all the stuff that surrounded her, the craziness, her life, her quirks, her whatnot. But when she was working, and the only thing she wouldn't tolerate was less than fully professional behavior on the part of her colleagues. And I think Glenn Gould was similar to that in a sense. He knew what he wanted and how to get it, and he was not going to put up with any crap from anybody, but he didn't have to. He had people who knew him, who he was comfortable with, and he, well, there you go. That's the summary of these 10 discs and all of the comments and other things that go back and forth. Unfortunately, the tapes did not exist for things that he did in between actual takes, for example, improvisations or playing other things or, tinkling the ivories. That apparently, because digital technology in the day when they did this was still in its infancy, and the time in the tape was expensive. The medium was expensive. They didn't keep the microphones on when he wasn't actually physically making takes, but there was a lot of stuff and banter in between. It would have been fun to know, I suppose, but that would have stretched this out to, 150 CDs, and it would cost even more. And so, what the heck? So yeah, this is interesting. It is for serious collectors. It's a historical document. I mean, is it an important one artistically? I think it is. I think it is for young pianists, for young artists who need to know the difference between believing your own PR and knowing what you're doing as a pro. Because Gould was a pro. And that's what we come away with when we hear this. And if you don't want to hear all the junk that went on behind it, just listen to the finished product. You'll be just as far ahead. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.